Welcome to the Empathy Stories channel, where we share profound tales of resilience, understanding, and the power of human connection. Today, we bring you the inspiring journey of Charlotte Hayes, a woman whose quiet strength turned an unjust encounter into a powerful movement for change. Stay with us for this unforgettable story of courage, advocacy, and lasting impact. Charlotte Hayes walked through the terminal at Logan International Airport with an air of quiet confidence. Her tailored navy blazer and silver hair, neatly swept back, made her stand out among the sea of hurried travelers. In her hand, she carried a sleek metallic briefcase that caught the light with every step, exuding an understated sophistication. People noticed her, as they often did, but few approached. Charlotte's calm, self-assured demeanor had been honed over decades of navigating high-stakes situations, and she carried herself with the grace of someone accustomed to commanding respect. But Charlotte knew better than to assume that respect was guaranteed. Life had taught her otherwise. The airport bustled with activity, the echo of announcements, the rhythmic shuffle of suitcases, and the murmur of conversation filled the air. Charlotte's destination was New York City, where she was scheduled to give an important speech to a room filled with influential figures. The opportunity was an honor, a chance to reflect on her years of service to her country and share lessons that might inspire others. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, Charlotte carried the quiet weight of someone who had spent her life navigating a world that often judged her by her appearance before her accomplishments. Approaching the first-class line at her gate, Charlotte handed her boarding pass and ID to the gate agent, a young woman with a crisp uniform and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Charlotte noticed the woman's gaze lingering on her briefcase, a subtle but telling pause. The moment passed quickly, with the agent wishing her a polite, "Enjoy your flight." Charlotte offered a faint smile in return, but the exchange left her with a familiar twinge of discomfort. She had seen that look before, once aboard the plane. The stark contrast between the bustling terminal and the tranquil first-class cabin enveloped Charlotte. The warm lighting, plush leather seats, and muted hum of conversation provided a fleeting sanctuary. Settling into her seat near the front of the cabin, she placed her briefcase in the overhead compartment with deliberate care. The soft click of the latch felt like a small act of assurance, a quiet reminder that she had control, at least for now. Moments later, a flight attendant appeared beside her. The woman's name tag read Lisa, and her smile, though bright, felt rehearsed. "Can I help you with that?" Lisa asked, her gaze fixed on the briefcase. "No, thank you," Charlotte replied, her tone measured but firm. Lisa lingered a moment too long, her curiosity poorly disguised. "Is there something valuable in there? It looks heavy." Charlotte raised an eyebrow ever so slightly, but maintained her composure. "Just personal items," she said evenly. The response should have ended the conversation, but it didn't. Lisa nodded, her smile faltering as she walked away, only to glance back at Charlotte moments later. Whispers followed, exchanged between Lisa and another crew member near the galley. Though discreet, their gestures carried an unmistakable intention. Charlotte had spent enough time decoding unspoken signals to know when she was being watched. Her mind drifted to the speech she would deliver in New York, the culmination of a lifetime of dedication to her country. She had always believed in the power of perseverance and resilience, in the strength of standing tall despite life's many challenges. But even as she prepared to speak about the importance of hope and progress, moments like these reminded her of how far there was still to go. The plane began to fill with passengers, the quiet shuffle of boarding adding to the cabin's subdued atmosphere. Charlotte opened her leather-bound notebook, letting the soft rustle of its pages ground her. She began jotting down fragments of ideas, her pen gliding smoothly across the paper. The act was as much about centering herself as it was about preparing her thoughts. Years in intelligence had taught her the value of focus, especially in moments of unease. Across the aisle, Lisa's uneasiness hadn't dissipated. Charlotte could feel the weight of her gaze, the subtle fidgeting that betrayed the flight attendant's discomfort. Lisa whispered to a colleague, her voice low but not low enough to escape Charlotte's notice. She doesn't feel right. Lisa murmured. That case, have you ever seen anything like it? And she's so guarded. Her colleague, a younger man sorting trays in the galley, sighed. She's a first-class passenger. They bring all kinds of stuff. Maybe it's business. It's not just the case. Lisa insisted. Her tone edged with something she couldn't quite name. There's something else. Charlotte, of course, heard every word. Years of experience had sharpened her instincts to detect tension before it escalated. She had faced far greater challenges than a wary flight attendant. Yet the quiet indignities, the glances, the whispers, the unspoken questions still cut deeper than she cared to admit. As the plane taxied to the runway, Charlotte closed her notebook and leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. The steady hum of the engines signaled their ascent. But Charlotte's mind remained alert. She allowed herself a brief moment of reprieve, her eyes fluttering shut as the plane climbed into the sky. Yet, deep down, she knew this flight would not be as uneventful as she might have hoped. It never was. Charlotte had learned long ago that turbulence came in many forms. Some of it shook the cabin, some of it shook the soul. By the time the plane touched down at JFK Airport, Charlotte Hayes' sense of unease had grown. The routine announcement to remain seated for a minor security matter confirmed what she had suspected. She glanced out the window and saw the flicker of red and blue lights on the tarmac. Emergency vehicles were parked alongside the terminal, their presence a jarring contrast to the calm inside the cabin. Passengers exchanged puzzled looks, murmuring quietly among themselves. But Charlotte didn't need anyone to explain. Years of navigating complex, high-pressure situations had sharpened her instincts. This wasn't a random security check. This was about her. When the uniformed officers boarded the plane, their firm but neutral announcement left no room for misunderstanding. Passenger in seat 2A, please remain seated. Charlotte met their gaze with calm composure, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She exuded the quiet dignity of someone who had faced scrutiny before and refused to let it define her. As the officers approached, whispers rippled through the cabin. Some passengers stared openly. Others exchanged knowing glances or whispered behind their hands. Charlotte felt the weight of their judgment, their silent assumptions pressing down on her like an invisible burden. Ma'am, we need you to step off the plane with us, the lead officer said. Charlotte's voice was steady as she asked, May I know why? It's a routine matter, he replied, his tone carefully measured. Please come with us. Routine. Charlotte almost allowed herself a bitter smile at the word, but she knew better than to resist. Without a word, she reached for her carry-on and stood, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The metallic briefcase in the overhead compartment gleamed as she retrieved it, the soft click of the latch breaking the tense silence. As Charlotte walked down the aisle, the whispers grew louder. Faces turned to watch her, some filled with concern, others with quiet curiosity, or worse, suspicion. Lisa, the flight attendant whose discomfort had set these events in motion, stood near the galley. Her expression was a mix of smugness and unease, her gaze darting away as Charlotte passed. The scene was far too familiar. Charlotte had spent a lifetime walking this tightrope, balancing her identity against the biases of others. She had learned to carry herself with unshakable confidence. But moments like this still left a bitter taste. In a private room within the terminal, the sterile walls and harsh fluorescent lighting only added to the discomfort. Charlotte set the briefcase on the table as instructed, her composure unbroken. What exactly is going on here? She asked, her voice polite but firm. We received a report about your luggage, the lead officer said, avoiding her gaze. We need to inspect it. Charlotte's brow furrowed, though her expression remained controlled. A report? From whom? That's not relevant right now, the officer said, his discomfort evident. Please unlock the case. For a moment, Charlotte studied him, letting the silence stretch long enough to make him shift uncomfortably. Then, with a nod, she entered the code and released the latches. The lid opened smoothly, revealing the contents within. A gasp rippled through the room. Nestled inside the briefcase, cradled in velvet lining, was the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Its golden emblem gleamed under the fluorescent lights, accompanied by an official certificate bearing the signature of the President of the United States. The officers stared, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief. One of them muttered under his breath, "Is this real?" "Yes," Charlotte said evenly. "It is. I received it yesterday for my contributions to national security." The lead officer stepped back, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Ma'am, we didn't realize—" "No," Charlotte interrupted, her tone sharp but measured. "You didn't. You made an assumption, and because of that, you've humiliated me in front of a plane full of people and delayed my journey for no reason." Lisa was summoned into the room by one of the officers. The sight of the medal drained the color from her face. She looked at Charlotte, her earlier smugness replaced by pale uncertainty. I thought. "You thought wrong," Charlotte said, her voice steady and cutting. "And now here we are." The tension in the room was palpable. The officers stumbled through apologies, their words fumbling and insincere. Charlotte offered none in return. Instead, she closed the briefcase with a soft click and walked out of the room with her head held high. Her dignity remained intact, even if her patience was worn thin. The ride from JFK to her hotel was quiet, the city's lights blurring past the car windows. Charlotte leaned her head back against the seat, letting out a slow breath. The events of the evening replayed in her mind, not with anger, but with a quiet clarity. She had faced worse situations in her career, moments where the stakes were life and death. Yet this felt different. It was personal in a way that stung deeper. At her hotel, Charlotte allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had endured judgment and assumptions throughout her life, but the weight of them never grew lighter. As she unpacked, her gaze lingered on the medal resting in the briefcase. It was meant to symbolize honor and achievement. Yet tonight, it had only served as a focal point for suspicion. This wasn't just her story, Charlotte reminded herself. It was the story of countless others who faced these indignities every day. She had been given a platform, a voice, and she knew she had a responsibility to use it. The next morning, she sat in a sleek conference room in downtown Manhattan, across from the airline's chief operating officer. A report lay on the table, detailing every misstep during the incident and recommendations for systemic changes. The executive stammered through an apology, but Charlotte wasn't interested in platitudes. Her voice was firm but calm as she said, "This isn't about one flight attendant or one mistake. It's about a system that allows these biases to go unchallenged. What are you going to do to ensure this never happens again?" She slid the report across the table, her movements precise and deliberate. "These are not suggestions," she said. "They are necessities." As she left the meeting, Charlotte felt a quiet sense of resolve. Change wouldn't come easily, but she had planted a seed. Whether it grew or withered was now up to them. For Charlotte Hayes, the fight was far from over. But for the first time since the plane had landed, she allowed herself to feel the faintest flicker of hope. Months had passed since Charlotte Hayes' encounter on the flight. The Passenger Equality Act, a legislative effort she had helped shape, was gaining traction in Congress. The incident with the airline had ignited a national conversation about bias and discrimination in air travel. What began as an isolated experience on a single flight had become a rallying point for change. Charlotte's days were filled with meetings, speeches, and workshops. She had taken on the role of an advocate, something she had never sought but felt compelled to embrace. The National Aviation Equity Commission, which she joined after the Act's passage, became the epicenter of her efforts to implement systemic reforms. Though the work was grueling and the opposition fierce, Charlotte approached each day with quiet determination, driven by the belief that progress was possible. One day, during a workshop at the headquarters of Horizon Airlines in Dallas, Charlotte stood at the back of the training room, observing. The session focused on implicit bias, guiding participants, pilots, flight attendants, and ground staff through scenarios designed to challenge their assumptions. Some attendees were skeptical, their folded arms and furrowed brows betraying their discomfort. Others leaned forward, engaged, their expressions thoughtful as they grappled with the material. Charlotte's presence was a quiet but powerful reminder of why they were there. Her calm demeanor exuded authority, but she didn't need to speak. Her story, which had circulated widely in the months following the legislation's introduction, carried enough weight. As the session progressed, Charlotte noticed flickers of understanding on some faces, moments when resistance softened into reflection. These small victories reassured her that change, though slow, was unfolding. After the session, as attendees filtered out, Charlotte was approached by Lisa Meyer, the very flight attendant who had reported her months earlier. Lisa's steps were hesitant, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her face carried a mix of shame and determination, emotions that seemed to war within her. "Miss Hayes," Lisa began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology." Charlotte turned to face her fully, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "Go on," she said simply. Lisa's voice wavered as she continued. "I made assumptions about you, about your briefcase, about who you were. I let my biases cloud my judgment. And I was wrong. The training sessions we've had since then have opened my eyes to things I didn't even realize I was doing. I'm truly sorry." Charlotte regarded Lisa for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. Then, with her characteristic steadiness, she replied, "Acknowledging your mistake is a start. What matters now is what you do moving forward." Tears glistened in Lisa's eyes as she nodded. "I won't let it happen again. I promise." Charlotte offered a small, encouraging smile. "Good. That's all any of us can do. Keep trying to be better." The encounter left Charlotte with a sense of quiet fulfillment. It wasn't the kind of sweeping victory that made headlines, but it was significant in its own way. Change often began with moments like these, personal, vulnerable, and deeply human. In the weeks that followed, the momentum for the Passenger Equality Act grew. Public support swelled as stories similar to Charlotte surfaced, each one painting a picture of a system in need of reform. Media outlets covered the bill extensively, and Charlotte found herself at the center of a movement she had never intended to lead. Her story, retold in interviews and opinion pieces, became a symbol of resilience and the power of standing up for what was right. One evening, as Charlotte prepared for a hearing on Capitol Hill, she received a message from a young woman who worked for an airline. "Because of you, they're listening," the message read. "Thank you for giving us hope." Charlotte set her phone down, her thoughts heavy but her heart steady. These messages, though brief, reminded her why the fight mattered. It wasn't just about her or the legislation. It was about creating a world where dignity and respect weren't privileges but rights. The morning of the hearing arrived, and Charlotte found herself once again in a room filled with lawmakers, journalists, and advocates. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her, but she remained composed. When her turn came to speak, she approached the witness stand with her silver briefcase in hand, a quiet symbol of the journey that had brought her here. "My name is Charlotte Hayes," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I am here today not just as a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, not just as a former intelligence officer, but as a woman who was judged unfairly because of how I look." Her testimony was both measured and powerful. She recounted her experience on the flight, weaving it into a broader narrative about systemic bias. Her words painted a vivid picture of the small, quiet indignities so many endured but rarely spoke about. "This is not just my story," she concluded. "It is the story of countless others who face these challenges every day. We have the power to change that, and we must." The room was silent for a moment before applause rippled through the chamber. It wasn't unanimous. Change rarely began that way, but it was enough to signal that her message had resonated. As Charlotte left the hearing, she felt a quiet resolve settle over her. The fight for justice was far from over, but she was ready to see it through. In the weeks that followed, she continued to push for the bill's passage, meeting with allies and skeptics alike, each conversation a step toward progress. Late one evening, back in her townhouse, Charlotte sat at her desk with her silver briefcase open before her. The Presidential Medal of Freedom lay inside, its golden emblem gleaming under the soft glow of her desk lamp. But her focus wasn't on the medal, it was on the future. She thought of the passengers who would one day board flights without fear of judgment, the airline staff who would learn to question their biases, and the countless individuals whose lives might be touched by her efforts. The work was slow, exhausting, and often frustrating, but it was worth it. For Charlotte Hayes, the journey had never been about recognition or accolades. It was about creating a better world, not just for herself, but for everyone who came after her. Thank you for joining us on the Empathy Stories channel. Charlotte Hayes' story reminds us of the importance of standing up against injustice and embracing the power of empathy to create meaningful change. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to support our mission of spreading awareness and inspiration. Together, let's continue to build a kinder, more equitable world. See you in the next story.